Alright, so in last week's video we talked about ways of keeping yourself warm, and we kind of focused on if your furnace were to break or if your power was going to go out, ways that you could keep yourself warm. In today's video I want to talk about keeping your whole home warm in an optimal condition. Okay, you have power, your furnace still works. What are some ways that you can regulate temperature so that you're not just throwing money out the window? I know that propane prices are going up, electric prices are going up, it's becoming very expensive to heat a house. So we want to make sure that the heat we are paying for is staying right where it needs to be. And so the two concepts that you need to understand, the first one being that heat rises. Now I am not talking about kinetic energy. Understand that there's no such thing as cold. Cold is just the absence of heat. I'm not talking about kinetic energy, I'm talking about temperature. The temperature is the measurement of the kinetic energy. The more kinetic energy something has, the hotter it is. The less it has, the colder it is. And you can measure that on a scale. I use the Fahrenheit scale. The rest of the world uses Celsius. But I'm talking about temperature, not kinetic energy. And when heat rises, the thing you have to pay attention to is that the cold air is also settling, right? And so if you live in a house, your basement is always colder than your main level. And your main level is always colder than your upstairs. Again, as long as it's an optimal condition, the heat is always going to rise, the cold's always going to settle. Your basement's always going to be cold, your attic's always going to be hot in a perfect situation, right? And so by utilizing that, if you're going to buy an apartment, being on the third, fourth, fifth floor means all that heat that people are turning on for the winter months is all rising to yours, and you're going to save money on your heating bill. My brother, he lives in a building where he lives on the top floor, the third story, or the third floor, the fourth story. So it has a basement. And so every single time that front door gets opened, all that cold air settles into that basement, and so then they crank their heat up. It's very hard for them to keep their apartments warm in the winter because all that cold air keeps settling down there, and they have to crank their heat. And then the next level turns their heat on, the next level barely turns their heat on, and my brother living on the top, he never turns his heat on. There are times it'll be the middle of winter and he'll have to crack his window open because it's so warm inside his apartment. Now on the flip side of that, in the summer when it's extremely hot, he cranks his air conditioner and it's very difficult for him to cool his apartment down. Okay, and so there is trade-offs, but you need to understand that heat rises and that cold air settles. And so if you are applying all the principles we talked about last week, you might want to do it as high as you can. Alright, so the second thing that you need to understand is that temperature is transferred in three different ways. That's conduction, convection, and radiation. And so starting with conduction, what conduction is, it's the physical transfer of temperature. If you go to grab a hot pan out of the oven, your hand's going to heat up and probably get burned. If there's a big chunk of ice and you put your hand on it, your hand's going to get cold and you might even get frostbite. And so you need to be mindful of these objects to be safe, but also not transfer temperatures that you don't want. Okay, if you don't want to be cold, don't go around touching ice. If you don't want to get hot, don't go around turning ovens on and heating up areas, right? And so you need to be mindful of what is hot and what is cold in your environment. There's a way around that though, and the way around that is insulation. And so if you grab a hot pad holder, you can grab that hot pan out of the oven, and the hot pad is going to keep your temperature, your body temperature on one side, and the hot pan temperature on the other. It's not going to allow that temperature to transfer through it. If I have a winter glove on and I touch a block of ice, I'm not going to get frostbite because it's going to keep the cold on one side and the warm on the other. It's not going to allow that physical transfer of temperature. And so a lot of people think that air is this great insulator. It is not. It's not a good insulator at all. What it is good at is it is good at regulating temperatures. And so if you sit down and you have a hot cup of coffee and I have an ice cold glass of chocolate milk, the air is going to neutralize those temperatures, meaning your coffee is going to get cold and my cold chocolate milk is going to get hot. Okay? And they're going to regulate. And that's really convenient. That's really good to know, because what that means is that if I have a furnace, okay, I can pump warm air into a room and the whole room is going to neutralize. All the air inside the room is going to neutralize. If that wasn't true, we would have to have a heater on every single wall in every single room, and we'd have to constantly be heating up everything. But because air will neutralize itself, we can have one furnace tucked way out of the way that no one can see, no one can hear, no one even knows it exists, and it can pump hot air through the ducts and heat up an entire room because the air inside the room neutralizes and balances, right? And so you need to have a physical barrier between you and the temperature you're trying to avoid, right? And so you need to insulate your walls. You can't just have air inside your wall cavities. You need to have physical insulation. You need to have insulated windows. Here in Minnesota, we have double pane windows. So it's a pane of glass, and then there's a gap that's full of gas. I don't remember what the gas is called, but it's full of gas, and then there's another pane of window. And a question I get asked all the time is, aren't you worried about breathing in that gas? Yeah, it's probably not good for you, but conveniently, every time a window shatters, you're instantly in a well-ventilated area. So it's probably not that dangerous, but it is insulated. We have insulated windows that help keep the warm on one side inside the home and the cold on the other, which is outside, and it doesn't transfer through it. And then same thing with our doors. We have weather stripping around everything, and so that the cold stays on the outside and the heat stays on the inside. Every single time you open that door, you're removing the insulation, hot's escaping, cold is coming in, and so you need to, because the hot air rises, the hot air escapes through the top, the cold air enters through the bottom. So every single time you open and close that door, you need to understand that you are removing the insulation and you are letting that heat that you're paying for escape, and you're letting that cold air outside come on in. You're inviting it in every single time. And so you need to be mindful of how many times you're actually opening and closing your doors. All right, so then we have conduction and we have convection. Now convection is the physical movement of temperature, okay? So a good example of this is a fan, right? In the middle of summer, and you have a fan on, what's happening is let's say it's 80 degrees outside, okay? Your core body temperature is 98.6. Your core body is heating up the air in front of you, and then that fan comes and blows that hot air away and replaces it with 80 degree air. And so then you're constantly heating it up, it blows it away and replaces it with cooler air, right? And it helps keep you cool because you're constantly getting rid of the hot and blowing in the new cooler air. Another example of this is your vehicle, right? In the middle of summer, you crank your air conditioner on and it blows cold air into your hot vehicle. Or in the middle of winter, you crank the heat on and it blows hot air into your cold vehicle, and then it regulates the temperature. That's what your furnace does. Your furnace kicks on, makes this hot fire, and then the fan blows all that hot air through the heating ducts into the rooms of your house, right? It's convection. And so that's one way to keep things cool or warm, but more importantly, it's usually how most people lose their heat. The windows and doors, again, typically what happens is the weather stripping in the door frame, it rips, it dissolves, it gets old, and people take it out and they don't replace it. And what happens is you have all these gaps that air is escaping and blowing into. Okay, so when your furnace kicks on and it's blowing heat, it's blowing the heat right out of those gaps. And then when your heater kicks off because your room is too temp, all that cold air starts blowing through, and you can actually sometimes hear it whistle through those cracks, right? And so you have to find ways to seal all that stuff up. You have to eliminate that gap on the bottom of the door. You have to eliminate the gaps in your windows. You can use that clear plastic. You can put plastic wrap around your windows to help seal them off, and so that the cold air can't escape, or the cold air can't enter and the hot air can't escape. You need to find ways to seal everything off so that nothing can blow away or get blown into your home. Another thing that I see all the time is people will close their windows, but they won't latch them shut. And the reason they don't latch them shut is because it's usually hard to do. The reason it's hard to do is because when you close it, there might be a little gap, right? So hot air is escaping, cold air is entering, and you got to push really hard to seal that gap, and then you lock it shut, and then it stays sealed. It stays pressed together really hard, and so it seals those gaps. So you have to lock those windows in order to eliminate those gaps, to eliminate the hot air escaping. Same thing with your doors. Your front and back door, you need to deadbolt them shut. If they have a deadbolt, you need to use that deadbolt. You need to push and deadbolt it, because what happens is you have a weather stripping and you have your door, okay? So it'd be like this, but you close your door and there's a tiny little gap between the weather stripping and the door. It's not until you push on it and seal that door into that weather stripping and then deadbolt it that it becomes completely sealed, right? Now heat can't escape, cold air can't penetrate, because you have completely sealed it off with that deadbolt, with the locks on the windows. So make sure you're sealing up your house, okay? Because that is the main thing I see all the time. People are like, oh, it's so cold in this one room. And it's a room where it's hard to lock the windows, so they just shut them and don't lock them. Once you push as hard as you can and you get them latched, the room heats up. Or it's the room with the door, right? The back door. It's always so cold. Well, it's missing the weather stripping, or it's not deadbolted shut. And so there's all these little gaps that the cold air is seeping in. So always pay attention to your windows and your doors. All right, so we talked about conduction, we talked about convection. Now let's talk about radiation. And what radiation is it's just projection of temperature, right? And so if you're sitting by a fire, you don't need to physically touch the fire. You don't need the wind to be blowing the fire towards you. Just being next to the fire, it's radiating heat, okay? Same thing with the frozen food aisle at your local grocery store. You walk down that frozen food section and it's cold, right? Those freezers are radiating the cold air, and it's colder in those frozen food sections. And so you need to be mindful of that. Typically when this happens is your windows. Your windows will be radiating cold because the outside is so cold that they've frozen your windows, and your windows are radiating cold. And the way to work around this is, again, insulation. If you can insulate your windows, if you can put a fleece blanket or a wool blanket or those blackout curtains, anything, any thick material that you can put over those windows to help keep them insulated, help keep the cold on the outside of the window instead of the inside of the window. Just making sure that they're not radiating. Or like doors, a lot of people have windows on their doors. They have a big window so that they can see outside, especially their back doors, and it's radiating cold air. Put a towel over it, put a blanket over it, put some blinds over it, put something on there so that it insulates from the outside. Okay, you want to make sure that you are keeping the heat that you're paying for inside your home, and you want to make sure that you are keeping the cold outside of your home. You don't want the cold seeping in. You don't want the hot escaping. You want to make sure that everything is well insulated, everything is sealed, everything, all the gaps are filled. There should be a sealed container full of your heat that you're paying for. You need to think of your home as a container. The roof needs to be insulated so that the heat rising doesn't just rise right out through the top. It needs to be insulated to help hold everything in. The outside can't come into your home. You need to have a sealed container where nothing can get in, nothing can get out. Because again, that air will neutralize. And so if you have cold air coming in, you're pumping in, all the air in your whole home is going to neutralize that cold air. If you are paying for the heat and the heat's just escaping, you're paying to heat the outside, okay? Your furnace is going to be running constantly, trying to keep up with the leakage, and your furnace is going to burn out because it's constantly running all winter long. You need to find ways to eliminate that from happening. So with that being said, leave any knowledge or questions in that comment section. I want to know what you think of this topic, and I can't wait to see you on my next video.